On the morning of October the 11th, 1943, Lieutenant Edward Calloway had a German submarine perfectly lined up in his bombsight. He was 26 years old. He was flying a B-24 Liberator on anti-submarine patrol over the North Atlantic, 500 miles southwest of the Azores. He had been in the air for 9 hours. He had been in this war for 2 years. He had watched American ships burn. He knew what U-boats did. The submarine was on the surface. It was moving slowly, barely making 4 knots, trailing a thin oil slick behind it. It had not seen him yet. He had altitude, and he had angle, and he had the element of complete surprise. In the jargon of anti-submarine warfare, this was called a sighting attack, and the protocol for a sighting attack was precise and rehearsed and simple. You do not hesitate. You do not circle. You drop your depth charges while the boat is still on the surface and cannot dive fast enough to escape them. You press the attack. This is what you do. Calloway began his attack run. At 500 feet and closing, he saw the hatch open. A man came out onto the casing, then another, then a third. They were not at action stations. They were not manning the deck gun. The third man out of the hatch was not standing. He was on his hands and knees on the deck of a submarine in the North Atlantic. And as Calloway's aircraft crossed over the conning tower at 350 feet, this man raised his head and looked directly up at the aircraft passing above him. Calloway pulled up. He did not drop his depth charges. He did not fire his guns. He pulled the aircraft into a climbing turn and came around and looked back at the submarine below him, and the submarine was still on the surface, and the men were still on the deck, and the man who had been on his knees was now on his feet, with both arms raised above his head. Calloway circled for 11 minutes. He called in the position. He requested a surface escort. He watched the submarine. It did not dive. It continued its slow 4-knot crawl through the Atlantic and leaked its thin oil slick, and the men on its deck did not go back inside. Then the submarine stopped, and then it began to settle by the stern. A Royal Navy destroyer arrived 4 hours later and recovered the surviving crew of U-608, 41 men. The boat had already been mortally damaged by a prior Royal Navy attack 2 days earlier and had been unable to dive. It sank in approximately 400 meters of water off the Azores at 1340 hours on October the 11th, 1943. Calloway's report of the incident stated that his attack run had been aborted due to a malfunction of the bomb release mechanism. The report was accepted without question. The Navy was satisfied with the outcome. 41 prisoners recovered, 1 U-boat sunk, crew available for interrogation. Nobody asked why the release mechanism had malfunctioned. Nobody looked at the bomb bay records. Nobody asked the pilot what he had actually seen at 350 feet. He did not tell anyone for 52 years. To understand why Calloway was where he was on the morning of October the 11th, you have to understand what the Battle of the Atlantic looked like from the cockpit of a patrol aircraft in the autumn of 1943, because it was not what it had looked like a year earlier. In 1942, the U-boats had been winning. They had been winning so badly that some historians later called it the Second Happy Time. German submarines hunting in American coastal waters, sinking tankers and freighters so close to shore that civilians on beaches in Florida and New Jersey could see the flames and smell the diesel fuel on the wind. The losses in 1942 were catastrophic. In just those 12 months, the U-boats sank over 500 Allied ships. The arithmetic was working in Germany's favor. By the autumn of 1943, the arithmetic had reversed. The Allies had cracked the Enigma cipher used by the U-boat command. They had deployed escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft that could now cover the mid-Atlantic gap that had previously been beyond the reach of land-based air cover. They had developed better depth charges, better radar, better tactics. The U-boats were now being sunk faster than they could be built. The men who sailed them had a statistical life expectancy so short that their submarine base at Lorient had developed its own specific culture of fatalism. Calloway knew all of this. He flew his patrols knowing that every U-boat he found was crewed by men who had already survived things that defied survival probability. He was not unsympathetic to this. He was also not particularly sympathetic to it. The U-boats had sunk American ships. He had a roommate in the Quonset hut at his base in the Azores who had come from the merchant marine and had been pulled out of the Atlantic twice. He understood what U-boats did to the men who served on the ships they sank. He pressed his attack runs. He was good at his job. He had 2 confirmed kills before October the 11th, and no hesitation on either. He was not a man who hesitated. He hesitated on October the 11th. The question he could never fully answer, in the 52 years before he told anyone what had happened, was exactly what he had seen that made him hesitate. He was certain about the man on his knees. He was certain about the raised arms. He was certain about the oil slick and the slow speed and the failure to dive. What he was not certain about, what he was never certain about, was whether those things had caused him to pull up or whether something else had. Something that had moved faster than his conscious mind and expressed itself as an action before he had fully understood that he was taking it. He had made a career of not examining this question, not because it was painful, though it was, but because it did not have an answer that he could fully trust. He had pulled up. The submarine had not escaped. 41 men had been pulled out of the Atlantic by the Royal Navy. These were the facts. The facts were not troubling. What was troubling was the mechanism, the question of whether what he had done was a decision or a reflex, whether it was mercy or simply a failure of nerve at the critical moment that happened to turn out well. He did not know the answer. He had filed the false report partly to protect himself from a question he could not answer, but that a court-martial might require him to answer. Edward Calloway came from Columbus, Ohio. His father was an insurance adjuster. His mother taught school. He had been a reasonable student, a better-than-average athlete, and had joined the Navy in December of 1941 because the Navy seemed to be where the immediate action was, and he was 24 years old, and the concept of not going where the action was felt impossible to him. He had trained as a naval aviator and had requested patrol duty because patrol duty was where the Atlantic War was being fought, and the Atlantic was where the Americans were dying. He flew his patrols. He pressed his attacks. He wrote in his letters home that he was fine, that the work was routine, that the food at the Azores base was adequate. He did not write about the October the 11th mission because the October the 11th mission had a report attached to it that said something that was not true, and writing home about things that were not true felt like a different category of problem from the report itself. The report was professional. A professional lie in a professional context. The letter home would have been a personal lie, and that felt different. He came home in 1945. He went back to Columbus. He used the GI Bill to finish the degree in business administration he had started before the war. He married a woman named Patricia in 1947. He worked for an insurance company, his father's firm initially, and then another. He had 2 children. He lived in Columbus for the rest of his life. He was pleasant and capable and competent and unremarkable in all the ways that people who have had extraordinary experiences and decided not to speak of them are unremarkable in the subsequent decades. He went to reunions of his patrol squadron. He talked about the war in the general terms that veterans use when they are among themselves, the names of places and aircraft and operations, the shared vocabulary of a shared experience. He did not talk about October the 11th, 1943. No one asked. There was nothing in the official record to suggest that October the 11th, 1943 was a day that required explanation. In 1991, his wife Patricia died. They had been married 44 years. He was 74 years old. His children were grown and lived in different cities and visited on holidays. He lived alone in the house in Columbus and continued to be pleasant and capable and unremarkable, and he thought about October the 11th more than he had thought about it in years, because there was now more time to think about things and fewer reasons not to. He had never known what had happened to the crew of U-608. He had called in the position. He had circled. He had watched the destroyer arrive from a distance as his fuel forced him to break off and head for base. He had filed his report. He had not followed up. He had not tried to find out. He had told himself that following up would have been suspicious, would have drawn attention to an incident the report was supposed to close. That was true. It was also true that he had not wanted to know. Not knowing had a certain protection to it. Not knowing meant he could not have been wrong about what he had seen. In 1994, a German historian named Klaus Hartmann was writing a book about U-boats sunk in the eastern Atlantic in the second half of 1943. He had obtained access to the complete records of U-608 from the German Naval Archives at Freiburg. He found, in the British records of the destroyer that had recovered the crew, a reference to an American patrol aircraft that had been present during the final hours of U-608's surface drift. He found Calloway's squadron records. He found the report about the malfunctioning bomb release. He sent a letter to the American Naval Historical Center in Washington. He asked if the pilot could be identified and contacted. The letter was forwarded to the Veterans Organization of Calloway's patrol squadron. The Veterans Organization had a list of members. Calloway was on it. He received a letter in November 1994 from the Veterans Organization forwarding Hartmann's inquiry. He read it twice. He put it on the kitchen table. He went to bed. He got up in the middle of the night and made coffee and read it again. He decided not to respond. He changed his mind in March 1995. He was 77 years old, and the feeling of not responding to a letter from a German historian about U-608 had not become easier in 4 months. It had become harder. He wrote back. He told Hartmann he was willing to speak. Hartmann called him. He was 38 years old and spoke careful, excellent English, and had spent 3 years on this book, and had interviewed the surviving crew members of U-608 who were still alive. He told Calloway what he had found. U-608 had been attacked on October the 9th, 1943, by a Royal Navy Sunderland flying boat. The attack had caused severe damage to the diving planes and the stern ballast tanks. The boat could no longer submerge. The captain had decided to make for the Azores and surrender, rather than send his crew to the bottom with a boat that could not fight and could not hide. They had been making for the Azores for 40 hours, on the surface, visible, when Calloway's aircraft had found them. Hartmann told Calloway that the submarine had already been sinking before Calloway's aircraft arrived. The depth charges Calloway had not dropped would have made no difference. The boat was going to the bottom of the Atlantic regardless. It was going slowly, because the stern compartments were taking water gradually, but it was going. The crew knew it was going. They had been watching it go for 40 hours. When the hatch opened on the morning of October the 11th, the crew came out not because they saw an aircraft and chose to surrender. They came out because the water in the stern had reached a point where the captain had ordered abandoned ship stations. They were coming out because the boat was already finished. Calloway listened to all of this on the phone in his kitchen in Columbus in March 1995. He listened without speaking. When Hartmann finished, Calloway asked one question. He asked, "The man on his knees on the deck, who was he?" Hartmann checked his notes. He said the first officer. His name was Oberleutnant Friedrich Lenz. He was 24 years old at the time. He had been injured in the October 9th attack. He came up through the hatch because the captain ordered all hands on deck, and the men helped him because his leg was damaged and he could not come up the ladder himself. Calloway said nothing for a moment. He said, "Did he survive?" Hartmann said yes. Friedrich Lenz had been captured by the Royal Navy on October the 11th, had spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner in Canada, and had returned to Germany in 1946. He had become an engineer. He had married and had children. He had died in Hamburg in 1989. Calloway said, "I see." He sat with that information for a while. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" Hartmann said, "Yes." Calloway said, "In your research, did Lenz ever say anything about the aircraft? About what happened that morning?" Hartmann said he had not interviewed Lenz directly. Lenz had died before the research began, but he had read Lenz's prisoner of war debriefing from 1943. He had read a short account Lenz had written for a German veterans publication in 1967. In both of these, Lenz described the morning of October the 11th. He described coming up through the hatch and being helped to stand and looking up and seeing the American aircraft directly overhead at very low altitude. He described the aircraft pulling up and banking away without dropping its weapons. He described watching it circle. In the veterans publication account, Hartmann said Lenz had written one sentence about the American pilot. He had written, "I do not know why he did not attack us. I have thought about it many times. I have never had an explanation." Calloway said, "No, he wouldn't have." He said that was all. He thanked Hartmann for calling. He said he hoped the book would be good. He hung up the phone. He sat in the kitchen in Columbus for a long time. What he had seen on the morning of October the 11th, 1943, was a man being helped out of a hatch by two other men because his leg was damaged and he could not climb out himself. The kneeling position was not a man surrendering, it was a man being helped to the deck by his crewmates. The raised arms were not raised arms. They were the arms of a man being steadied by the men beside him. He had pulled up because he had seen what he thought was surrender. He had actually seen a wounded officer being helped to the deck of a sinking boat. The two things had looked identical from 350 feet at 350 miles per hour. They had looked identical because at that altitude and that speed, the human eye cannot distinguish between a man surrendering and a man being helped to stand. Both look like arms going up. Both look like a specific gesture of vulnerability. He had been wrong about what he had seen. He had been wrong in a way that had made no operational difference, because the boat was already sinking. He had been wrong in a way that had saved 41 lives, including the life of a man named Friedrich Lenz, who had become an engineer in Hamburg and had died in 1989 without ever knowing the name of the American pilot who had looked down at him from 350 feet and pulled up. He was wrong and right at the same time. He had misread the situation and arrived at an outcome that required no correction. The false report was protecting a decision he had not fully made, in favor of a calculation he had not fully run, in a situation he had not fully understood. Patricia had known something. Not the specifics. She had never asked, and he had never told. But after 44 years she had known, in the way people who live close to another person come to know things. Not through what is said, but through what is not said. There are things a person carries in the way they sit with the lights off. Patricia had known that October the 11th, 1943, was a day that existed separately from the rest of his war stories, filed in a different category, not mentioned because it had been deliberately not mentioned, which is different from forgotten. She had never asked. That was part of what he had meant when he said she was the right woman. She understood the specific grammar of his silences. After she died, he found himself in the kitchen some evenings going over it in a way he had largely managed to avoid while she was alive. Not obsessively, not with anguish. With the patient, circling attention of a man trying to understand something he has always known he cannot fully understand but feels obligated to keep attempting. He would sit with his coffee and reconstruct those 2 seconds. The approach, the altitude, the angle, the man on the deck, and try to determine what exactly had happened in the moment between seeing and acting. Between the bomb sight and the pulled-up yoke. Between the finger that was a fraction of a second from pressing the release and the hand that instead gripped the controls and pulled. He could reconstruct every second before and every second after. The 2 seconds themselves remained opaque. That specific opacity had been with him for 50 years and showed no sign of resolving. It did not feel like a wound. It felt more like a foreign object, something that had entered him and could not be removed and had simply been incorporated over time into the structure of how he worked. His son had asked, at that Christmas dinner after the phone call from Hartmann, whether knowing that the boat was already sinking made any difference, whether it resolved anything. Calloway had said, "It changes what I was looking at. It doesn't change what I did." His son had considered this. He had said, "But it means you didn't cost anyone anything." Calloway had said, "I know that. That's not the same as understanding what happened." He said the question was not whether it had been the right outcome. The outcome was clearly the right outcome. 41 men alive, no Allied ships sunk by U-608 after October the 11th. The question was whether he had made a decision or whether a decision had made itself through him. And he had no confident answer to that question. And he was not sure the answer could be known, and he had arrived at a kind of peace with that uncertainty without fully resolving it. His son said, "You know, most people would just say they made a good call." Calloway said, "Most people weren't there." That was the end of the conversation. They ate the rest of the Christmas dinner and talked about other things, and the story went back into its drawer. And it stayed there until the reunion in 1997, when he took it out again one final time. He told his son about it that Christmas. He told him briefly and without drama, the way he told all stories. He said there was something he had not explained about the war. He said he wanted to explain it now. His son listened. His son did not ask many questions, because his father was not a man who answered many questions, and his son had learned this in childhood and never unlearned it. His son asked, "Do you feel better, now that you know?" Calloway thought about this. He said, "I feel different. I'm not sure better is the right word." He was asked, at a squadron reunion in 1997, if he wanted to share any memories of the war. He said he had a story. He told it in the same brief, undramatic way he had told his son. The men in the room listened. Some of them had their own stories they had not told. The room was quiet when he finished. Someone asked, "Why didn't you tell your commander at the time?" He said, "Because I didn't understand what I had done, and because I wasn't sure it was the right thing. And because it turned out not to matter, and things that turn out not to matter are easier not to explain." He paused. Then he said, "And I didn't want to answer the question of why, because I didn't have a good answer. I still don't." He said the decision had taken less than 2 seconds. He said he did not know how to describe what had happened in those 2 seconds in any language that would fully satisfy either a court-martial or a reunion audience or himself. He had pulled up. The boat had sunk. The men had been saved. The first officer had become an engineer in Hamburg. The story had an ending that was difficult to object to. But the story had a middle that he had never been able to explain to his own satisfaction, and he was not going to try to explain it now. He did not need a good answer. He needed no court-martial. He needed no vindication. He was 80 years old, and he had carried this for 54 years. And now he had said it out loud, and that was enough. Edward Calloway died in 2001 in Columbus, Ohio. He was 83 years old. His son was with him. He had outlived Patricia by a decade, and the war by 56 years, and Friedrich Lenz by 12. His obituary in the Columbus Dispatch mentioned his naval service and his career in insurance and his family. It did not mention October the 11th, 1943. There was no reason it should have. From the outside, from the perspective of the official record, nothing had happened on October the 11th, 1943 that required mentioning. A bomb release mechanism had malfunctioned. A U-boat had sunk. 41 men had been rescued. The pilot had continued his patrol and returned to base. The only thing not in the record was the 2 seconds when the record diverged from what actually happened. 2 seconds in an attack run over the North Atlantic, in which a 26-year-old pilot from Columbus, Ohio, looked down at a man on the deck of a sinking submarine and saw something that his hands understood before his mind did. He never told his commander why, because the why was 2 seconds of something that had no name. Because the man on the deck was not what he thought the man on the deck was. Because the boat was already sinking, and the answer to the why did not change the outcome, and did not change the report, and did not change anything except the part of him that carried it for 52 years before he set it down. He had looked at a man he was about to kill and pulled up. That is what happened. The reason it happened is still in the 2 seconds, somewhere in the space between seeing and deciding where things happen that cannot be fully retrieved or explained. Friedrich Lenz died in Hamburg in 1989 without knowing the pilot's name. Edward Calloway died in Columbus in 2001 without knowing whether what he had done was courage or error or mercy or reflex. The boat sank anyway. The men were saved anyway. The war ended anyway. And nobody, including the 2 men most directly involved, ever fully understood those 2 seconds over the North Atlantic when everything became what it became. Some things happen in the space between one breath and the next. They are too fast for explanation and too large for silence. Edward Calloway carried one of them for 52 years. When he finally put it down, he found that putting it down did not resolve it. It only made it speakable. That, for a man from Columbus who did not talk about difficult things, was enough.